Hello coders, today we're going to be taking a look at for loops, so let's dive into it. All right, so we do have a little index HTML file. Let me update this. It should say for loops, because we've already looked at while loops, so let's dive into that one. All right, so in our main.js is where we're going to write all our code. The first thing we want to start off is the basic breakdown of a for loop. Now we've looked at while loops before, and while loops did have one expression. For loops are different in that they have three expressions. So a for loop begins with a for statement, and then the first expression that you have is called the initialization expression. Now with the initialization expression, essentially what we're using it for is to create the value that is going to be used in order to tell the loop when to stop, right? Because remember, we looked at while loops. With a while loop, you always have an expression that dictates that will become false at some point, and that's when the loop stops running. With for loops, it's the same. They also have a conditional expression, but they also do package in this initialization expression so that we can just set the stage there. So what we're going to go with is we're going to let our index value equal to 0. Index, of course, it's not a keyword or anything, but it does represent typically like an index of an array or an index of iteration as you're looping through things. So it's a fine name to use, but it's just a variable name. It could be anything. You'll see I very typically used. You could, if you're indexing through like an array of numbers, it could be number index. It could be anything you want. It's just a variable. All right, so there's our first expression. So we want to let index equal 0. The next thing we're going to do, and we're going to do a very similar loop that we did with the while loop, in which we'll run from 0 to 9 and then exit on 10. So we can say index is less than 10. So there's our conditional expression. And then it also has another expression, which is the final expression. The final expression can be any expression, of course. Typically what it's used for is some type of incrementation or something that's pushing the conditional expression towards false. Right. So if we look here again, our initialization expression, we have index is equal to 0. We have a conditional expression of index less than 10, which means that as long as this is true, the code block will run once we get that going. And then we have a final expression. For our final expression, we're going to keep it simple. We're just going to say index plus plus. So that means that every time the work has completed for the loop, we want to take the value of index, increment it by 1, and then reassign that value. And again, that should give us a total of 10 iterations. And then once index gets up to the value of 10, this conditional expression will fire and the loop will stop. All right, so let's go ahead and then create a code block. And for the first one, let's just console log the index variable. And we'll go ahead and give it a label. Say index, and then we'll say index. All right. So if we open this code, there's our for loop demo page. Let's go ahead and inspect it, open up our dev tools. If we look in the console, we will see the console log once for each iteration of the loop. It's all in the same line, of course, line 6. If we take a look at our code, right? Oh, helps look at the actual JS. There's line 6 where our console log is. So for every iteration of the loop, we get that value of whatever the index value is. Now, we can also take a look at this through the inspector. It's very useful to do so when looking at for loops. So let's go ahead and go to sources and then to our main.js. And we can go ahead and put a line here right on line 6. All right, so there's our breakpoint, and then the code should stop if I hit refresh the page. Notice the line stops here on line 6 where the breakpoint is, and the first thing it's going to do is run our console log. Now, if we look up here at index, we can highlight it. It's still the value of 0. There's no change there. If we look here under our variables in our block, index is equal to 0. And if we highlight our conditional expression, this is RAM, but we can check it. It's true because 0 is less than 10. So of course we go into the work of the loop. In this case, we're going to log out that index value. If we move forward 1 and we check our console, there's our index, our first console log with index of the value of 0. We notice now that we're at the final expression. So the flow that we want to keep in mind is the first thing that happens is the initial expression. After the initial expression kind of sets the stage for the loop, our conditional expression is checked. If the conditional expression is true, we will then do the work inside of the code block. If you do happen to create a conditional expression that starts out as false, that does mean that the loop will never run. So you always want to make sure that your conditional expression is something that will allow the loop to run at least once. Typically more than that, but at least once, because otherwise it won't do any work. So initial expression, then we get to our conditional expression, that runs. We get down to the code, it runs, and then once the code is completed, we get to the final expression. In this case, we're using the final expression to increment the value of the index variable. So if we highlight it now, we can see that it's 0. We can also see that it's 0 here. But if we step forward, we'll notice now that index is 1. We are no longer on the final expression. We've now moved back to the conditional expression. So we can highlight that. And if we look at index less than 10, so is 1 less than 10, that is true. We step forward again, and it goes back into the work of the code block. And this is where in a for loop, you can really see where the loop is going, because what we're going to do is conditional expression, code block, final expression, conditional expression, code block, final expression. And it just loops through those expressions until the conditional expression becomes false. So we have our next console log. We step forward, we check the console, there's index at 1. Then we go back up to the final expression, and index is incremented to 2. We get to the conditional expression is 2 less than 10. It is. Step forward, run the console log again, back to the final expression, back to the conditional expression, and so on and so forth. And let's go ahead and do that so that we can see how it's looping. Here we go, code block, final expression, conditional expression, code block, final expression, conditional expression. Index is currently 6. If we check the console, we'll see our current console logs up until that point. Let's go ahead and step forward until we get to 9. Okay, so now index value is 9. If we check our conditional expression, is index less than 10? 9 is less than 10, that's true. So the code will run again. We're going to get one more console log. It goes to the final expression. Index is incremented in that expression now to 10. Is 10 less than 10? Of course, we know it's not. We can highlight it and prove that it is false. So then we step forward and the code is done running. So that's really it with the for loop. We noticed with the while loop that you could say the initial expression kind of happened outside of the while loop and the final expression happens within it. If we're doing something like this where we're adding values up, for loops are nice enough to organize them kind of in one place. So at the start of the loop, what gets everything going, what's checking to make sure that will become false at some point, that's our index less than 10. And then our final expression, which is incrementing the value of index to eventually get it up to 10, so the loop will stop running and we don't get an infinite loop. All right, so let's go ahead and do something else here with our for loop, something that's much more common. And that is looping through an array. So let's make an array here. We'll just say numbers array. All right, and we're going to set that equal to, let's go 0, 1, helps to put the values actually inside of the brackets. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. All right. So let's say we want to loop through this numbers array and we want to log out every value that's in there. Okay, so let's try that. Let's go console log. Get your formatting right. Console log, and we're going to say numbers array. So we want to console log the numbers array, but what do we want to console log? We want to console log the numbers array at a particular index. In this case, we're just going to go ahead and loop through each index starting with 0. So what we can put in here, now we could put 0, right? But all that's going to do is every time the code runs, it's going to console log out numbers array at 0. And let's go ahead and do that just so that we can see the result of it. We can turn off this breakpoint, go to our console. If we refresh the page, we get 0 logged out 10 times. So what we can do to access each index of the array is make use of our index variable, because arrays start at 0 index, and look at that, our index variable also starts at 0. So if we do numbers array at index, we should get some different output. So if we go ahead and refresh the page, we check our console, And there we go, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, so on and so forth, up until 9. And actually, let's go ahead and jump in and take a look at that inside the Sources tab. So if we go here, we can go ahead and put on our console again, we can put another breakpoint, and we'll just go ahead and cruise through this one. So numbers array at index. So index is currently 0. If we highlight the entire expression, this is super helpful so you can see what you're actually targeting. We'll see numbers at index, or numbers array at index, numbers array at 0, in this case, is the number 0. All right, so if we step forward, we're going to notice that we have our console log, our first one for 0. We get to our final expression, index is incremented. I'm sorry, 1 less than 10. We step forward. But now, numbers array at index, numbers array at 1, index is incremented, right? So we're targeting the next index of the array. And if we highlight, it'll say 1, because that's where the number 1 is. That's on the 1 index. And if we step through there, we can see again, goes to the final expression, does the conditional expression, does the console log, and then just continues to do that until we get to the value of 10 for index, because 10 is not less than 10, and then it exits the loop. So a very common thing to do with a for loop is to loop through the indexes of an array. But what happens if we have an array that doesn't have just 10 indexes, right? That could be a problem, because currently we're using less than 10. Well, there's a trick that we can use for that. Not really a trick, but just some logic that we can use. So instead of saying index is less than 10, we can take advantage of the length property on the array. And let's go ahead and do that. So we say instead of index is less than 10, we can say index is less than numbers array dot length. Because the length property will always have the total number of indexes. And by saying less than, we're saying one index less than the total. Because for this array, for numbers array, the length would be 10, right? But the indexes are 0 through 9 because of 0 indexing. So that's why we use less than numbers array dot length. So that way, this array could have 9 values in it. It could have, oh, we need to do that. Could have 9 values in it. It could have, there we go, 10 values, 11, 12, so on and so forth, right? We have no idea, let's say we had no idea how long the array is, how many indexes it has. We don't have to with a for loop set up this way because we can just make use of the length property. So in this case, we have 12. If we save that and then check it again, and this time we won't walk through the whole thing. I'll just click on resume execution and go to the console. Oh, there we go. Had to refresh it. And now we have 0 through 12. So big thing to keep in mind when you're looping through an array, if you need to loop through an array, take advantage of that length property that's on the numbers, not the numbers array, on any array. It'll exist on any array. But also remember that the indexes, the total number of indexes, or the highest index, is always going to be 1 less than the length. And that's again because the length will be the total number of items, in this case 13. But the indexes will be 0 through 12. And that's again because arrays are 0 indexed. Now it's worth pointing out that by putting numbers array here, like numbers array dot length, this array does not have any connection to this loop. We're just using the length property of the loop in order to get a value that we want to use for how many times we want the loop to run, what our condition, our end condition value is. So it doesn't connect the array to the loop in any way or anything like that. We're just taking advantage of the fact that the numbers array will have a length of 13, and that if we do less than that by 1, we can loop through every index. But again, this is just a nice trick to make sure you can go through every index of an array. Now, another thing that's worth touching on is going backwards inside of a for loop. So everything we've seen so far is about going like from a low number to a higher number. But what if we wanted to go in reverse order through a loop? Now, what's nice about a loop is these 3 expressions is it gives us a lot of flexibility for how we might want to do that. So let's think about if we wanted to start logging from 12 and get down to 0. So the index starting at 0, we definitely don't want to do that because if we start the index at 0, then that's going to start at the beginning of the array. But what we want to start at is the end of the array. Now, what value represents that? Numbers array.length minus 1. Because remember, length will always be the total number of items, which is going to be 1 more than the number of indexes. So we can go ahead and copy that over here. And we do want to make sure to subtract 1 from it. There we go. We don't need extra stuff in there. All right. So now index is at numbers array.length minus 1. So that means it's going to start at whatever this value is. So for our conditional expression, do we still want it to be index less than numbers array.length? And that is not the case, because index less than numbers array.length is never going to run if we start at the end of the array by using this here for our index variable. So instead, what we're looking for is index greater than or equal to the first index of the array. And what number represents the first index in the array? That is the number 0. All right, so now we have our initialization expression is setting us up with a value for index that will represent the last item of the array. Our conditional expression will continue to be true until index becomes less than 0. Now the next thing we have to look at is our final expression. Our final expression has been used so far to increment the value of index, right? So we start at the beginning of the array, we increment the value by 1, and we'll continue to move through the indexes. But in this case, we no longer want to do that. Instead, we want to decrement, and we can do that using minus minus. So by using index minus minus as the final expression, we're saying after this code runs, whatever this is, I want you to take the value of index and decrease it by 1. So now if we look at our setup, our initialization expression gives us the length minus 1, which will target the end index of the array. We're going to continue to run the loop until index becomes less than 0, which would indicate less than the first index of the array, the 0 index. And the final expression is going to go ahead and decrement the value of index so that for each iteration, we'll move back 1 index in the array. All right, so if we console log numbers array at index, the expectation is that we'll get a bunch of console logs starting from 12 and going down to 0. Let's go ahead and check that out and see if it's the case. All right, so if we look here in the console, we can see 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, all the way down to 0. So our loop did work. But let's go ahead and take a look at it so we can kind of visualize what's happening. Okay, if I refresh the page, look at the value of index is 12, because that's numbers array.length minus 1. Our conditional expression is 12 greater than or equal to 0. It is, and that's why we're in the code block. Now, if we highlight numbers array at 12, that's going to give us the number 12 in this case. So if we step forward, we can see now that index is going to be decremented by 1. So index is still 12. Once the final expression runs, index is decremented. So is 10 greater than equal to 0? It is. Step forward. If we console log numbers array at index, that's going to be the number 10. If we check our console, there's our 12. Oh, here we go. Let's step forward again. Index is 9. Console log that. Isn't that interesting? We went 12, 10, 9. Let's go ahead and refresh. I think something interesting happened there. Let's give it a shot. I may have clicked on something. So let's start over. There we go. Console, because it worked the first time, right? This is the fun of programming. So we step forward. Okay, index is currently 12. It gets decremented. Now index is 11. Okay, that's looking better. Okay, so is 11 greater than equal to 0? It is. That's true. We then get into the code. It runs again. We get to the index, decrements it to 10, and so on and so forth. It just keeps looping through the final expression, the conditional expression, and the work. So if we click through that pretty quick, we can see it keeps decrementing. Eventually it gets to 0. Now, is 0 greater than equal to 0? It is. So that's going to be our final one. We get to the code block. It does the console. And if we check here, there's all of our console logs. We step forward again. Index is now 0. It's going to be decremented. Notice now it's -1. And this is where we hit the false for our final or for our conditional expression. We highlight is -1 greater than or equal to 0. It's not. So we step forward and the code is done. All right, so let's go back and look at the code real quick. So things to keep in mind with the for loop. The for loop, when using the initialization expression, you want to use that to set whatever the initial value of your index variable should be. In this case, if we're going starting at the end of the array, we can make use of that length, subtract 1 from it, and that'll start at the end. If we want to start at the beginning of an array, we can start with 0. If we're not using an array at all, we can start at any value we want. The big thing is to remember about the initialization expression is it's used to create an index variable that the loop will use in order to know when it should stop running. The conditional expression is very similar to the conditional expression of a while loop. It contains an expression that will at some point become false, or hopefully, otherwise you get an infinite loop. But the conditional expression's job is to tell the loop when to stop. So once this expression becomes false, don't do any more work. And then we have our final expression, which is typically used to make some change to the index variable that will invariably drive it towards becoming false in the conditional expression. For this one, for our last one, we were decrementing the value of index. If we were to reset this back to what we originally had, say index less than numbers array.length, and then index plus. This will start at 0 and then work by one at a time through. Basically, again, the final expression is just used to make some change to the index variable in order to make sure that this expression becomes false at some point, so the loop stops. That's really the big stuff to remember with for loops. That's it. Make sure to reach out to your instructors if you do have any questions. These can be a little challenging, but with practice, it'll make more sense. Have fun with these, and we'll be talking to you.